There are documents that do not reach the public by accident. There are files that remain locked not because of bureaucracy, but because of the deliberate decision of people who understood with absolute clarity that certain truths are too heavy to be carried by everyone. This is the case of what is about to be revealed here. For decades, Bruce Lee's name was surrounded by mystery. His premature death, the rumors about his physical powers that defied human understanding, the reports of people who saw him train and left the place without being able to properly describe what they had witnessed. Much has been attributed to the myth, the exaggeration, the adoration that fans naturally build around icons. But what if some of what seemed like exaggeration was actually a distorted reflection of an even more extraordinary reality? In 2019, an independent researcher working on a collection of documents donated by a former U.S. military advisor came across something that shouldn't have been there. These were no ordinary military reports. These were not operational briefings. They were eyewitness accounts, signed, dated, and classified with a seal that loosely translated means containment of information sensitive to social balance. An elegant euphemism for a simple thing: it can't go away from here. What these documents describe is an event that occurred in the early 1970s in an unidentified location to which Bruce Lee was summoned, not invited, summoned, to face an opponent. The witnesses present, whose names were partially redacted in the files, describe a being with human features but with a presence that did not fit into what we know as human. One wrote with disturbing precision, "I knew it was a person, and at the same time I knew it wasn't." Bruce Lee won, and according to the documents, this victory was not just personal. It was described in so many words as the event that prevented an invasion. What does this mean? Where did this being come from? Why was Bruce Lee chosen? And why, to this day, has this remained buried under layers of institutional silence? That's what we're going to explore next. What does this mean? This question seems simple. 3 words, a straightforward construction. But when applied to what is described in these documents, it opens up like an abyss. And the more you look inside, the more you realize that the edges have no end. Let's start with the most obvious, because that's exactly where the biggest mistake lies. The natural tendency of any person when faced with information of this magnitude is to seek an immediate rational explanation. The human brain was built to find patterns, to fit the unknown into categories that already exist, because the unknown is uncomfortable and the familiar is safe. So the first reaction is always the same. There must be a simple explanation. A mistake, a misinterpretation, a montage. But here's the problem with this reaction. The documents in question were not produced by enthusiasts. They were not written on internet forums or transcribed from anonymous reports. They were signed by people who spent years of their lives being trained to observe, describe, and report with surgical precision. People for whom the analysis error was not a professional failure, it was a failure that cost lives. And yet, faced with what they saw that night, the cold, technical language of the reports simply gave way. One of the documents uses the expression category anomaly, a term that in military vocabulary is reserved for situations in which the observed event does not have a drawer in which to be archived. It's not denial, it is explicit recognition that something has escaped the acquaintance's inventory. So what does this mean? It means, firstly, that the question about the nature of Bruce Lee's opponent is not the most important question. It's the most seductive, for sure. The mind goes straight to it because it is the most cinematic, the most vivid. But there is an earlier, more fundamental question that needs to be asked before any other. Why was this hidden? Governments hide things all the time. This is not conspiracy theory. It is documented history with examples ranging from the Manhattan Project to the MK Ultra experiments to operations that took decades to be publicly admitted. The criteria for secrecy, in most cases, are relatively predictable: national security, strategic advantage, technology protection. These are reasons that, even when morally debatable, have an understandable internal logic. but the specific seal found in these files, the one that was translated as containment of information sensitive to social balance, points to a different motivation. It wasn't about protecting a technology. It was not about preserving a military advantage. It was about protecting something much more fragile and much more powerful at the same time: the collective perception of reality. The decision to bury this event was not motivated by strategy. It was motivated by fear of what happens when people discover that the world is fundamentally different from what they believed it was. And that's where the figure of Bruce Lee takes on a completely new dimension. Because if the official narrative was already extraordinary, a man with a small frame who redefined what the human body was capable of, who created an entirely original fighting philosophy, who influenced generations of athletes, artists, and thinkers. Imagine what it means to discover that behind this public narrative was an even deeper layer. A layer in which this same man was placed in front of something that the rest of humanity didn't even know existed and emerged victorious. This raises a series of questions that unfold into each other like doors within doors. Did he know before that night what he would find? Was his obsessive training, his relentless pursuit of the limits of body and mind, just discipline, or was it preparation for something specific? Who summoned him, and why did they believe he was the right man for that moment? And most disturbing of all, if he prevented an invasion, what exactly was prevented? Where would this invasion come from? And was what was blocked that night definitively closed or just postponed? The answers are in the documents, and that's where we are going now. Where did this being come from? There is a curious pattern in the history of humanity. Every time a civilization finds something it can't explain, it does one of two things. Either it destroys what it found, or it turns it into myth. It rarely preserves, rarely documents honestly. Because documenting honestly requires admitting that there is a gap in knowledge. And gaps in knowledge are terrifying to any power structure that runs on the premise that it knows more than others. The files found in 2019 represent a rare exception to this pattern. Someone, at some point, made the decision to register, to put on paper, with the characteristic coldness of bureaucratic language, what had been seen. And that is precisely why one of the most disturbing pages in the entire collection is not the one that describes the fight itself. It is the one that tries, in a visibly uncomfortable way, to answer the question that none of those present could avoid asking that night. Where did this being come from? The official response recorded in the document is, in itself, revealing for what it does not say. After 3 paragraphs of extremely controlled technical language, the writer, identified only by the initials RM, writes a sentence that completely clashes with the tone of the rest of the report, almost as if the hand had acted independently of the trained mind. The sentence is, "Origin was not established because none of the available categories were applicable." Pause for a moment on this sentence. A professional used to classifying, categorizing, and filing every form of known threat when faced with that being did not find a single drawer to fit it into. It was not a foreign agent. It was not an identifiable biological experiment. It was nothing that was in any manual, in any briefing, in any of the scenarios that these people had been trained to respond to. The absence of a category was not incompetence. It was the silent recognition of something much more serious. That being did not come from anywhere they knew. And this is where we need to expand the horizon of the conversation, because the question of where it came from carries within it at least 3 distinct questions, each one deeper than the last. The first is geographic. What physical place did this being come from? The second is biological. From what species, what lineage, what developmental process did it emerge? And the third, the one that the archive's writers clearly trying to avoid, but which ends up spilling over between the lines, is ontological. What layer of reality did it come from? Some researchers who have had access to partial copies of these documents point to a sequence of events that predates the fight by several months. Reports of sightings in mountainous regions of Southeast Asia recorded by American military sources during the period of the Vietnam War describe encounters with human-like entities that demonstrated physical and perceptive capabilities outside the known spectrum. These records were long dismissed as byproducts of combat stress, collective hallucinations of men subjected to extreme conditions. But when overlaid with what the 2019 documents describe, a geographic and temporal pattern begins to emerge that is difficult to ignore. The being that faced Bruce Lee would not have appeared out of nowhere. It would have arrived from somewhere, through some path, for some reason. And the fact that military records of the region show unexplained anomalies in the months before the event suggests that that night was not a first contact. It was a culmination point, the end of a process that had begun much earlier, somewhere between the mountains and the silence of what still has no name. What came from there, the one who walked here, and what he expected to find when he arrived? This last part is the one that holds the most disturbing secret of all, because if there was an intention behind the arrival of that being, then Bruce Lee's victory was not just physical, it was the collapse of a plan. And plans, when they collapse, leave traces. It is these tracks that we follow now. To understand why Bruce Lee was chosen, one must first understand the issue in its entirety. Not the fight itself. That's the consequence. The problem begins much earlier, in a chain of events that, looking from the outside, looks like a series of coincidences. But as one of the documents in the archive notes, in a marginal note that appears to have been added later by a hand other than that of the original writer, coincidences on a sufficient scale cease to be coincidences. What the files reveal, when read in sequence and not in a fragmented way as they circulated among independent researchers, is that American authorities had detected something in the months before the event. They didn't know how to name it, they didn't know how to classify, but they knew, with a certainty that the documents convey in an almost palpable way, that there was a presence moving towards a point of convergence. An entity that did not respond to any of the known containment or negotiation protocols, that could not be bought, threatened, or intercepted by conventional means, and that, according to projections prepared by analysts whose names remain completely redacted in the files, there was a window for action, a specific moment within a specific period in which the invasion, the word used literally in the document, without quotation marks, without qualifiers, could be initiated. The problem, therefore, was not just identifying the threat, it was finding an answer for her within that window. And that's where conventional means completely failed. Weapons did not work in preliminary containment tests. Reports describe attempts at immobilization that simply had no effect. Technology, numerical strength, weaponry, everything that makes up a military power's response arsenal has been tested in controlled situations and found the same result: total ineffectiveness. The being was not invulnerable in the absolute physical sense, but operated at a frequency of speed, perception, and response that rendered any technology-based approach obsolete before it was even executed. It was then that someone, in some closed room, asked the question that changed everything. What if the answer wasn't technological? Bruce Lee had attracted attention from circles that the general public was unaware of long before he became a cinematic icon, not for his films, but for private demonstrations that circulated in reports among American military and intelligence agents based in Asia. What these reports described was not just unusual speed or strength, it was something observers had difficulty articulating: a quality of presence, an ability to read an opponent that seemed to function at a level prior to physical movement, as if Bruce Lee realized the intention before it turned into action, as if the space between thought and strike simply didn't exist for him in the same way it does for any other human being. This specific quality was exactly what analysts had identified as the only possible vector of response to the entity. Because the being could not be surprised by technology, but perhaps it could be encountered on equal terms by someone operating at the same level of presence and perception. Someone who through absolutely unique training had developed capabilities that touched the border between the human and something that we still don't have adequate words to describe. Bruce Lee wasn't chosen because he was strong. He was chosen because he was, at that moment in history, the human being who had come closest to transcending the conventional limits of perception and response time. His philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, was, in essence, a methodology for eliminating the gap between perception and action. And it was precisely this interval that represented the entity's only known vulnerability. The documents do not reveal how the summons took place, nor what was said to him. They reveal only that he went, that he understood what was before him, and that he fought. And he won. What happened inside that fight is the densest, most disturbing, and most extraordinary chapter of anything the archives contain. That's where we're going now. The fight lasted less time than anyone present expected. This is one of the few details on which all witnesses agree without contradiction. There was no long and dramatic battle like the ones Bruce Lee starred in on screen. There was a meeting, a mutual assessment that reports describe as almost static, almost contemplative. Two beings measuring each other on a level that precedes physical movement. And then, in an interval that one of the witnesses describes as shorter than the time it takes to realize something has happened, it was all over. The being fell. He was not found dead. The documents are deliberately vague about what happened to him after the fall. And that vagueness in itself is information. In military reports, the absence of detail is rarely accidental. It's a choice. It means that what happened next was considered too sensitive, even for the classification level of those files, which places this information in a layer of secrecy that very few people in the world have accessed. What we know from what has been recorded is that Bruce Lee left that place without visible injuries, that he did not speak about what had happened to anyone outside his immediate circle of containment, and that in the following months he demonstrated behavior that those close to him described in retrospect as that of someone carrying a weight that could not be named. The invasion did not happen. This is the central fact. The convergence point that had been calculated by analysts passed without incident. Whatever that being represented, a vanguard, an emissary, the first movement of something greater, was halted that night, and the world continued to spin without knowing that it had come dangerously close to a rupture whose dimensions are still not completely understood, even by those who documented it. So why the silence? Why, decades later, does this remain buried? The simplest answer would be to say that governments always hide what threatens their authority. And that is true, but it is an incomplete truth in this case, because what is at stake here goes beyond the authority of a specific government. What is at stake is the collective mental architecture upon which all human civilization is built, the belief that we are the dominant form of consciousness on this plane of existence. The premise, never questioned because it never needed to be openly questioned, that the world we see is the world that exists. If this story were to become public in a verifiable way, with documents, with names, with the chain of custody that would make it irrefutable, the impact would not only be political or scientific, it would be philosophical in the deepest and most destabilizing sense of the word. Every belief system, every religious structure, every scientific model would have to be re-examined in light of a new variable. That there are ways of being that share this space with us and that arrived here with intentions that were not peaceful. And this is where institutional silence finds its most honest, if disturbing, justification. It's not just about power, it's about protection. The decision to bury these files was, in the charitable reading possible, a decision to protect the psychological stability of a civilization that has not yet developed the cultural, philosophical, or emotional tools to process this information without collapsing. But here lies the contradiction that no file resolves. Because if the threat was real, and the documents strongly suggest that it was, then the silence that protects us today is the same silence that prevents us from preparing for tomorrow. And if what was interrupted that night was merely postponed, then somewhere, at some point we cannot calculate, that point of convergence will reopen. And this time, Bruce Lee won't be here. The file closes without completion. The last page is blank. And to this day, no one knows whether this was an oversight or a message.